Chasms, canyons, pyramids, and minarets. And so near, so grim, so ghastly desolate, and yet so threatening. And then Fanny Brandeis was seized with mountain terror. It is a disease recognized by mountain men everywhere, and it is panic, pure and simple. It is fear brought on by the immensity and the silence of the mountains. A great horror of the vastness and ruggedness came upon her. It was colossal. It was crushing. It was nauseating. She began to run, a mistake that, when one is following a mountain trail, at best an elusive thing. In 5 minutes she had lost the trail. She stopped and scolded herself sternly, and looked about her. She saw the faint trail line again, or thought she saw it, and made toward it, and found it to be no trail at all. She knew that she must not be more than an hour's walk from Timberline Cabin and Albert Edward and his biscuits and tea. Why be frightened? It was absurd. But she was frightened, horribly, harrowingly. The great, grim rock masses seemed to be shaking with silent laughter. She began to run again. She was very cold, and a piercing wind had sprung up. She kept on walking doggedly, reasoning with herself quite calmly, and proud of her calmness, which proves how terrified she really was. Then the snow came, not slowly, not gradually, but a blanket of it, as it does come in the mountains, shutting off everything. And suddenly Fanny's terror vanished. She felt quite free from weariness. She was alive and tingling to her fingertips. The psychology of fear is a fascinating thing. Fanny had reached the second stage. She was quite taken out of herself. She forgot her stone-bruised feet. She was no longer conscious of cold. She ran now fleetly, lightly, the ground seeming to spur her on. She had given up the trail completely now. She told herself that if she ran on, down, 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 she must come to the valley sometime. Unless she was turned about and headed in the direction of one of those hideous chasms. She stopped a moment, peering through the snow curtain, but she could see nothing. She ran on, lightly, laughing a little. Then her feet met a projection. She stumbled, and fell flat over a slab of wood that jutted out of the ground. She lay there a moment, dazed. Then she sat up and bent down to look at this thing that had tripped her. Probably a tree trunk. Then she must be near timberline. She bent closer. It was a rough wooden slab. Closer still. There were words carved on it. She lay flat and managed to make them out painfully. Here lies Sarah Cannon, lay to rest and died alone. April 26, 1893. Fanny had heard the story of Sarah Cannon, a stern spinster who had achieved the climb to the peak, and who had met with mishap on the down trail. Her guide had left her to go for help. When the relief party returned, hours later, they had found her dead. Fanny sprang up, filled with a furious energy. She felt strangely light and clear-headed. She ran on, stopped, ran again. Now she was making little short runs, here and there. It was snowing furiously, vindictively. It seemed to her that she had been running for hours. It probably was minutes. Suddenly she sank down, got to her feet again, stumbled on perhaps a dozen paces, and sank down again. It was as though her knees had turned liquid. She lay there with her eyes shut. "I'm just resting," she told herself. "In a minute I'll go on. In a minute, after I've rested." "Hello!" from somewhere on the other side of the snow blanket. "Hello!" Fanny sat up, helloing shrilly, hysterically. She got to her feet staggeringly, and Clarence Hale walked toward her. "You ought to be spanked for this," he said. Fanny began to cry weakly. She felt no curiosity as to his being there. She wasn't at all sure that he actually was there, for that matter. At that thought she dug a frantic hand into his arm. He seemed to understand, for he said, "It's all right. I'm real enough. Can you walk?" "Yes." But she tried it and found she could not. She decided that she was too tired to care. "I stumbled over a thing, a horrible thing, a gravestone, and I must have hurt my leg. I didn't know." She leaned against him, a dead weight. "Tell you what," said Hale cheerfully. "You wait here. I'll go down to Timberline Cabin for help, and come back." "You couldn't manage it alone, if I tried? If I tried to walk?" "Oh, impossible." His tone was brisk. Now you sit right down here." She sank down obediently. She felt a little sorry for herself, and glad, too, and queer, and not at all cold. She looked up at him dumbly. He was smiling. "All right?" She nodded. He turned abruptly. The snow hid him from sight at once. Here lies Sarah Cannon, laid to rest and died alone, April 26, 1893. She sank down and pillowed her head on her arms. She knew that this was the end. She was very drowsy and not at all sad. Happy, if anything. "You didn't really think I'd leave you, did you, Fan?" She opened her eyes. Hale was there. He reached down and lifted her lightly to her feet. "Timberline cabin's not 100 yards away. I just did it to try you." She had spirit enough left to say, "Beast!" Then he swung her up and carried her down the trail. He carried her not in his arms as they do in books and in the movies. He could not have gone 100 feet that way. He carried her over his shoulder like a sack of meal, by one arm and one leg, I regret to say. Any Boy Scout knows that trick, and will tell you what I mean. It is the most effectual carrying method known, though unromantic. And so they came to Timberline Cabin, and Albert Edward Cobbins was in the doorway. Hale put her down gently on the bench that ran alongside the table, the hospitable table that bore 2 smoking cups of tea. Fanny's lips were cracked, and the skin was peeling from her nose, and her hair was straggling, and her eyes red-rimmed. She drank the tea in great gulps, and then she went into the tiny bunk room and tumbled into one of the shelf bunks and slept. When she awoke she sat up in terror, and bumped her head against the bunk above, and called, "Clancy!" "Yep," from the next room. He came to the door. The acrid smell of their pipes was incense in her nostrils. "Rested?" "What time is it?" 7 o'clock. Dinner time. Ham and eggs." She got up stiffly, and bathed her roughened face, and produced a powder pad they carry them in the face of danger, death, and dissolution and dusted it over her scaly nose. She did her hair, her vigorous, abundant hair that shone in the lamplight, pulled down her blouse, surveyed her torn shoes ruefully, donned the khaki skirt that Albert Edward had magically produced from somewhere to take the place of her breeches. She dusted her shoes with a bit of rag, regarded herself steadily in the wavering mirror, and went in. The 2 men were talking quietly. Albert Edward was moving deftly from stove to table. They both looked up as she came in, and she looked at Hale. Their eyes held. Albert Edward was as sporting a gentleman as the late dear king whose name he bore. He went out to tend Hale's horse, he said. It was little he knew of horses, and he rather feared them, as does a sailing man, but he went, nevertheless. Hale still looked at Fanny, and Fanny at him. "It's absurd," said Fanny. "It's the kind of thing that doesn't happen." "It's simple enough, really," he answered. "I saw Ella Monahan in Chicago, and she told me all she knew, and something of what she had guessed. I waited a few days and came back. I had to." He smiled. "A pretty job you've made of it trying to be selfish." At that she smiled, too, pitifully enough, for her lower lip trembled. She caught it between her teeth in a last sharp effort at self-control. "Don't!" she quavered. And then, in a panic, her 2 hands came up in a vain effort to hide the tears. She sank down on the rough bench by the table, and the proud head came down on her arms so that there was a little clatter and tinkle among the supper things spread on the table. Then quiet. Clarence Hale stared. He stared helplessly, as does a man who has never, in all his life, been called upon to comfort a woman in tears. Then instinct came to his rescue. He made her side of the table in 2 strides. Your favorite film star couldn't have done it better. Put his 2 hands on her shoulders, and neatly shifted the bowed head from the cold, hard surface of the tabletop to the warm, rough, tobacco-scented comfort of his coat. It rested there quite naturally. Just as naturally Fanny's arm crept up and about his neck. So they remained for a moment, until he bent so that his lips touched her hair. Her head came up at that, sharply, so that it bumped his chin. They both laughed, looking into each other's eyes, but at what they saw there they stopped laughing and were serious. "Dear," said Hale. Dearest.